All right, let's just jump right in. We're about to crack open a single page from, well, one of the most complex and fascinating texts on the planet, the Talmud. Now, I know what you might be thinking, a dusty old religious book, right? I want you to just push that image aside. Think of it more like the transcript of a 1,500-year-old argument that's still going on. It's like a high-stakes intellectual boot camp where logic gets stretched and tested and pushed to its absolute breaking point.
So, to get our heads in the right space, let's start with a modern-day puzzle. Imagine you're making a dish, and it has to weigh exactly 1 pound. You're just a little bit short, so you add some extra salt, an ingredient that's required anyway. Now, does the weight of that salt count towards the final pound? It's a really specific, kind of weird question, right? Well, that is exactly the kind of puzzle the Talmudic sages absolutely love to chew on.
And that leads us perfectly to our first case, straight from the ancient temple in Jerusalem. We'll call this one the salty pigeon. Yep, you heard me right. The debate is technically about a bird offering, but the real issue, the thing they're really arguing about, is legal thresholds and what actually counts as part of the offering itself.
Okay, for any of this to make a lick of sense, you need to know one key term, kizayat. It literally means olive bulk. Just think of it as a minimum weight requirement. For a sacrificial offering to be legally legit, it had to have at least an olive's bulk of flesh. Any less than that, and a whole bunch of rules just, poof, they don't apply. So here is the exact dilemma posed by a scholar named Rava. You've got the head of a pigeon offering, but on its own, it's just too small. It's less than an olive bulk. But here's the thing. All offerings had to be salted. So what if the required salt that's sticking to the pigeon head pushes the total weight over that minimum threshold? Does the salt, which is an external but totally required ingredient, get to combine with the flesh to make the whole thing legally valid? Now this is where it gets really cool. Look at how they try to solve this. Instead of just giving a direct yes or no, they use an analogy. They compare the salt to a bone. The argument for the bone counting is, well, it's part of the animal, same material. The argument against it is that if the bone separates, it's useless. Now look at the salt. The argument for the salt is that it's a required part of the process, but the argument against it is that it's a totally different substance. See what they're doing? By comparing these two, they're not just looking for an answer, they're stress testing the very definition of what an offering even is.
And after all that back and forth, what's the big answer? Get this. Teku. It's an Aramaic word that basically means, let it stand. Yep, the question is left hanging, totally unresolved. And this is so important. For the sages, it was actually more honest, more valuable, to just admit, you know what, we can't solve this one, than to force some easy answer that doesn't really work. The real genius, you see, was in the questioning, not just the answering.
All right, let's move on to puzzle number 2. You can already see how this whole logical framework starts to build on itself. This next one is all about timing and location. We're shifting from what an offering is to when it can get disqualified. Let's call this the fitness test. So the setup here is basically a legal minefield. An animal is slaughtered correctly inside the temple courtyard, totally valid. But what happens if before you can put it on the altar, somebody takes it outside the courtyard? Well, the moment it crosses that line, it's immediately disqualified. So the big question becomes, what exactly are you liable for?
A scholar, Rabbi Yosei HaGelili, makes an argument. He says if you slaughter the animal outside the temple walls to begin with, it was never a valid offering in the first place, so you can't be liable for the second step of offering it. But the other rabbis spot a huge hole in his logic. They say, whoa, wait a minute. When you take a perfectly fit offering and you carry it outside, it becomes unfit. So now the act of offering it up is happening to an unfit item. By your logic, you should be exempt in that case too. But we all know the law says you're liable. Bam! They've caught him in a logical contradiction. And this is where the analysis just goes to another level. 2 other scholars jump in to defend Rabbi Yosei, but they do it in completely different ways. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says the key difference is whether the offering ever had a moment of fitness. If it's slaughtered inside, it was fit, even for just a second. Slaughtered outside, it never was. But then Rabbi Elazar comes in and says, no, what matters is how it became disqualified. And you can see how this slaughter at night test case just shatters Rabbi Yehuda's logic. Because if he slaughtered at night, it's invalid immediately. It never had that moment of fitness. But it doesn't break Rabbi Elazar's logic. This is the whole point. These aren't just different ways of saying the same thing. They are 2 fundamentally different legal principles. Okay, on to our final puzzle. And this one is the most intricate yet. It's about a person who is ritually impure eating sacrificial food. So what you've got is a forbidden act meeting a forbidden substance.
The whole debate boils down to which prohibition wins.
The scholar Rabba just cuts through all the noise with this incredible insight. He realizes the whole argument, everything they're debating, hinges on this sequence of events. In scenario A, if a person becomes impure first and then eats the sacred meat, everyone agrees they're liable. Why? Because the prohibition attached to the person first. But in scenario B, where the meat becomes impure first and then an impure person eats it, well, that's where things get really, really complicated.
And here's why it gets so complicated. There's this general legal principle that basically says you can't have double jeopardy for a forbidden item. Once the meat is declared impure, it's already prohibited. So the argument goes, you can't just pile a second prohibition on top of it when an impure person comes along and eats it. It's like the first prohibition is already occupying that legal space.
But of course, there's a potential loophole. What if that second prohibition is way more severe than the first one? You see, the prohibition against an impure person eating sacred food carried a much heavier penalty, karet, which is often translated as being spiritually cut off. It's a much, much more severe consequence than the penalty for just eating some impure meat. So now the question becomes, does that more severe prohibition have enough power to just override the lesser one that's already in place?
So it seems like a pretty clear-cut case, right? The penalty for the person is obviously worse, so that prohibition should be the one that applies. But just when you think you've got it all figured out, this final twist comes from a scholar named Rav Ashi, and he just completely reframes the entire debate. Rav Ashi comes in and asks this devastatingly simple question. He says, hang on a second, are we actually sure which prohibition is more severe? Yeah, sure, the penalty for the person is harsher, but think about it. An impure person, they can become pure again through a ritual. But that impure sacrificial meat, that's it. It can never become pure again. Its status is permanent. So from that angle, isn't the prohibition on the meat the one that's actually more stringent? He doesn't even answer his own question. He just completely blows up the foundation everyone was arguing on. It's brilliant.
So, after trekking through salty pigeons and disqualified offerings and competing impurities, what's the big takeaway? You know, the point isn't really the specific rulings on these ancient rituals. The point is the process. This whole thing is a masterclass in the art of the argument. Let's just quickly recap the intellectual toolkit we've seen. We saw how they use analogies, like the bone versus the salt, not just to explain something, but to actually investigate it. We saw them test every single principle with these wild edge cases, like slaughtering an animal at night. We saw that the why behind a rule was always more important than the what. And maybe most importantly of all, we saw this profound comfort with ambiguity, this courage to just say, teku, let the question stand. And really, that leaves us with one final thought. What this ancient text is suggesting is that the highest form of thinking isn't about finding the right answer. It's about asking better questions. It's a process that values intellectual rigor and honesty and just exploring an idea from every single angle you can imagine. So if the goal isn't just to be right, but to understand more deeply, what questions should we be asking in our own lives?